them all long before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all long before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up through some bucks down. Todd told the valet pull the truck around. Push the line after we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my grand told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for their prohibition bandwidth. Blood trickle from the leaders he was planning. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. Boy, that flight to Amsterdam. When my accountant of minus my family found out too and didn't like it. You're not in the salon with Dale said and I thought he was biased. Then I got a Venmo that said copy the finest. Before my foolishness settled in, recorded a whole tape before we got to Berlin. This close to giving up and now never again. Don't overlook the work and come expecting to win. In the end, my word, never put nothing over the squad. Got it right up under their nose, gentrified the facade. Off the cliff with broken wings, I'm aware of the odds. Enough faith for us all, I'm the one for the job. Most days, catching sun rays, baby, look like the front page. Overthinking what they might say, have it your way. Yeah, the biggest threat is something they never seen. Dial it up, patch me into the screen. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up.
What's going on, everybody? Thanks for joining me for a special edition of Lukman Nation, a Black Alliance for Peace, All African People's Revolutionary Party Black Power media special on the conflict in Ukraine. But we don't want to center this conflict, this issue, on just focusing on Ukraine, because really, this is not about Ukraine. This conflict is about the axis of the US, EU, and NATO domination. Those three entities joining together to impose imperialism around the world, and have been for quite some time. But in all of the countries that they have imposed the same kinds of policies, done the same kinds of things that we're seeing happening right now in Ukraine, all those other countries that these things were done in, nobody really paid any attention to them. And we're going to get into why that is today. So we're going to decenter Europe in this entire conversation about the US, EU, and NATO axis of domination. But I cannot have this conversation myself because it's a lot. So joining me today, I am very happy to be joined by two badass sisters who I'm always glad to be in any kind of space with. Erica Keynes, one of the editors of Hood Communist. You have got to read Hood Communist, hoodcommunist.org, and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. And Onyusonwu Chatoye, who is a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Y'all, let's not waste any time. Thank you for joining me. Let's get into this. What is NATO? Why does NATO exist? Why is nobody talking about NATO in this whole conflict, first of all? So, Onyusonwu, I want to throw it to you and Those locks are fire. They are beautiful. They are so lovely on you coming in. That's great. So come on.
There's a lot of good luck on the stream right now. It's a lot of good luck. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that is a very benign sounding name for what is essentially a white supremacist, imperialist, reactionary military alliance of European powers dominated by the United States. What NATO is basically the way that the Western world unites to destroy anti-colonial movements all over this planet. They have had a hand in invasions in Africa. For example, the destruction of Libya that happened under Obama in 2011 was a NATO project. If history goes back even farther, when the PIGC was fighting against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, NATO propped up Portugal to resist the anti-colonial struggles of those Africans. Same thing happened in Algeria, same thing happened in Guinea, same thing happened in Mozambique. So NATO is basically white power united to repress the colonized world.
I mean, you know, whenever we talk about NATO and these kinds of militaristic organizations that the US loves to put out there as like the defenders of democracy and all that kind of bullshit, Ricky, they never get to that part, right? They never get to that part in the description and the definition and honestly the purpose of an organization like NATO. They never get to the part where it is a white supremacist organization like Onyeson shared, because NATO doesn't exist to defend any of the nations in the Caribbean. They don't exist to defend any of the African nations. It's all the quote North American treaty organizations. So, I mean, so what does that mean, Ricky, when we are told in this country that NATO exists to defend North American nations? What does that mean to all of the other countries of the world that NATO doesn't defend?
Right. I think it's important to note that Black Alliance for Peace was established on April 4th in 2017, not only as a way to sort of honor Dr. King and the Black radical peace tradition, but also because NATO was established on April 4th. So NATO is an illegitimate, aggressive structure in the service of Western imperialism, as Onye noted. And then we have a Peace and Hood Communists that Comrade Dijibo Subukwe wrote, where he goes through the details and the history of NATO on the continent, how it was established to create regular bases along the colonies, and that the imperialist powers were able to set up military installations in African territories, which fell into the hands of which it fell into their hands during war. So, and in that context, the U.S. was important because they were like the principled leaders of the capitalist defense system, and that came in the form of NATO. So AFRICOM, as we understand, is an extension of NATO, and AFRICOM is also one of BAP's focuses because it's a component of the current iteration of NATO in Africa, which just droned Somalia. So yes, I think that that's some important details about it, because we see it as Onye stated. We could go as far as the history of how it was established, but in its current iteration, we could see it as the devastation in Libya. We could see it through the coups that currently happen, maybe not directly, but indirectly, as all of the coup leaders were not only trained by French military in Mali and Burkina Faso and in Guinea-Conakry, but also by AFRICOM. So NATO has a stronghold on the continent.
So I just want to let folks know that I just dropped the article on in Hood Communist by Jibo Sobukwe about NATO in Africa. And just really quickly, I want to share for folks who may not be able to grab it right away. I just want to share the view of the article so you'll see. This is what NATO does. All right, this is the result, the end result of what NATO does. But this is in Africa. NATO in Africa, colonial violence and structural white supremacy. That article is in the chat for you to grab. So let's talk about just very briefly, because I do not want this conversation to be dominated by Ukraine, because the thing I think that is really getting under my skin about this conflict is that the whole world, it seems like, is just crying all the tears, y'all, for Ukraine. And I don't want to make it seem as if I am unconcerned with the loss of life or the threat to people's lives in Ukraine. I am talking about the response to what NATO, the US, and the EU created in Ukraine that has come from the rest of, oh, everybody's concerned about Ukraine. You cannot click on a web page without a banner up there with a link that you can click on that says donate here to support refugees in Ukraine, donate here to support people in Ukraine, to give them money for, to survive the war, and donate for Ukrainian freedom. And I mean, Saturday Night Live did their weird cold opening. I don't even watch Saturday Night Live, but somebody shared it to me, and I'm like, oh Jesus! They had the Ukrainian choir, allegedly. Y'all need to tell me where they found the Ukrainian choir that fast. Come on. I think that we have been so indoctrinated by little tidbits of information, like 128 characters of information in a tweet and 7 seconds of information in a video on Snapchat or Instagram or whatever, that we don't stop, breathe, and use more than like the collection of synapses that we need to critically think. I really think that social media, as good as it is kind of conditioning us to just look at things in snapshots and not take the time that it needs to critically think about issues that takes longer than a tweet or a 7-second video. Because I mean, did it strike you all as strange that Saturday Night Live was able to find a whole Ukrainian choir real quick for their little cold opening, like the very day that the military action in Ukraine happened? Was it me? Am I being paranoid, y'all?
I mean, I feel like if we look at the privilege, I suppose, I can't say that word, but I can't think of anything better, that's being given to Ukrainian refugees in this moment, I don't think it probably would be that difficult, because they're just being let in, as opposed to where we're seeing others or other colonized folks having more difficulty. So I don't know if it would be that difficult if we examine the immigration situation happening with Ukrainian refugees currently.
That's a good point, and we're going to get into that definitely. But Anya, you were shaking your head like, what are your thoughts?
I don't think it was a coincidence. I think they had that ready to go because the U.S. and NATO have been trying to provoke this conflict for quite some time. The fact of the matter is that like people feel more empathy for Ukrainians because they present as European, so that's part of what's happening. But the other part of what's happening is that the entire like propaganda apparatus of capitalism and imperialism has been turned towards creating empathy for these people because they want to justify U.S. and NATO intervention in the situation. So that's what's happening. We understand they control the media platforms, like even SNL, movies, newspapers, 24-hour news, like that's the voice of the ruling class. And so when the ruling class has a particular objective, which in this case is making sure that the European Union remains energy dependent upon the United States and also isolating Russia, they will turn the entire apparatus to achieving that objective. So I feel like that's what we're seeing more than anything else, is that they want to justify this intervention. So they need as much empathy for Ukraine as possible.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, so when we're talking about what is happening in Ukraine, if people haven't figured out that this is not, it's more than a Putin thing, right? This is really like a several years long plan that the US and NATO, and to some degree, but maybe a lesser degree, but to some degree, certainly the EU has had to maintain their dominance in the region. So real quick, what does the US and the EU and NATO have to do with this conflict in Ukraine? Why, when we talk about these three entities, are we talking about an axis of domination that is showing up in this conflict in Ukraine, where the US and Western media is making it seem like, oh, it's Russia bullying Ukraine, but it's really the US, the EU, and NATO in the background literally pulling the strings and putting all this in motion several years ago. So Ricky, what's some of the background on that?
Yeah, I knew, like I noted, as far as the coups in Mali, that is a joint initiative with the training, right? That is France and the U.S. Involved in that, and we see that in a lot of the areas where the U.S. is. And then I think it's also important to note that the members of the EU sort of have they sort of colonize or like play colony roles for the U.S. The U.S. has so much influence and power over these nations. Oh, it's my love. the U.S. has so much power over these other nations, and so much so is that they can strong arm Germany out of doing what's best for its own citizens and cutting off a deal with Russia. And all of this is towards the expansion of Western hegemony, to expand Western imperialism, but it's also ultimately to benefit the U.S. that wants to control or maintain its empire status, because it is crumbling from the inside. The infrastructure domestically is terrible, and all of this money that's going towards war, and Biden's numbers have not increased, his poll numbers. So we know that that's always the normal trick, is to engage in warlike activities to boost up, that patriotic morale. It's just disappointing this go round that we see so many Africans invested in that, but it's only noted it's a manufactured sort of consent that we have been set up for through, anti-communist rhetoric and such. I can go on my spiel about postmodernism, but that's another show. All of these things set us up to not interrogate. And also, like, my disappointment is really like witnessing all of what's happening. Being on the brink of like a potential nuclear war. I think we need to be, realistic about that. Nuclear war is a bad thing. And then this is the moment where we see the left sort of being not confused, but sort of choosing to be sectarian in this moment, right? Instead of having any sort of materialist analysis, any historical analysis. And I think that thwarts the way that we're able to understand what the US, EU, and NATO is doing, or even understand imperialism as a primary contradiction. Khalifa and myself wrote about the Biden-Harris administration and their endless, war. And in that article, we note specifically, the investment that they have had with the extreme sanctions on Ethiopia, Eritrea, Iran, Venezuela, what they tried to do with Cuba, the year Haiti has had under this administration last year. Those are the extensions of that axis of domination that we speak about.
Anya, what do you say?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So, what has the US and the EU and NATO, what has their hand been in precipitating this conflict in Ukraine, just as a pivot point to everything they've been doing everywhere else?
Well, they started it. It's their fault. That's why we're here. They without question started that shit intentionally, knowingly, decades ago. So after the fall of the USSR, which I'm recently learning, U.S. and NATO powers also played a hand in, especially with the election of Boris Yeltsin, who then went on to appoint Putin. So Putin is their fault. But after the fall of the USSR, when the Russia and the U.S. Were normalizing relations, like Russia was turning towards the West. They had a Western-friendly Russia. Yep. The certain agreements were made between the U.S. and NATO powers and Russia about expanding NATO. The promises made were that NATO would not expand eastwards towards Russia's borders because Russia correctly understood NATO as a direct threat to their security. I think Ricky just said that NATO was formed in the first place as a way to oppose the USSR, as a way to fight communism. So Russia understood correctly why this alliance existed. They were like, if you want normal ties with us, you cannot continue to spread this. They agreed. They agreed. And then President Bill Clinton came in and was like, psych, immediately started pulling all of these Eastern European countries into NATO. As recently as 2008, there was a diplomatic cable sent by the U.S. ambassador to Russia. His name is William Burns. He's actually director of the CIA under Biden right now. And in that diplomatic cable, it straight up says, membership for Ukraine and Georgia in NATO is a red line for Russia. Russia has security concerns. Russia is especially concerned that NATO membership for Ukraine could lead to a civil war in Ukraine. So all of this.
Well, hold on. What date was that? What date was that?
2008. So it's just like they knew, like this was all, like there were right-wing foreign policy analysts in U.S. administration after U.S. administration saying very clearly what would happen if this was pursued. So the fact that people are trying to act like this came out of nowhere, like Putin's just a madman, acting irrationally, when it was predicted systematically over the course of decades, like they clearly provoked this intentionally.
Yeah, and a couple. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ricky.
In MSNBC, an article, Comrade Jimmy Mafia sent me an article today in MSNBC. It was an opinion article where they actually say, yes, it probably was our fault. So
probably, maybe, perhaps.
Probably did that. Yeah, we made, because they actually admit to what Anya is saying. There has been analysts who have been talking about this for years and decades, that the potential to expand or attempting to expand NATO would cause this sort of reaction, because it would violate a lot of agreements that have been made. And so now MSNBC is trying to, at least through an opinion article, peel back a little bit of that truth, because you can't hide those things.
I mean, see, you can hide it when it's just us Negroes saying it, because who listens to us? Who listens to the Black people? When we talked about Bill Clinton and the U.S. government literally sending a team to Moscow to manage the campaign, the re-election campaign of Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was so unpopular in Russia. They hated that dude. He implemented these neoliberal austerity policies in Russia that the Russian people hated. His poll numbers tanked. He knew he was not going to get reelected. He begged for help from Washington. There's a recording of a phone call between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, where Yeltsin says, okay, but you have to promise me that NATO is not going to be expanded 1 inch further. And Bill Clinton is like, yes, I promise. And exactly like you said, Anya, when Yeltsin was reelected with the help of Bill Clinton literally sending people to Moscow to manage his campaign, they propped up a whole media re-election campaign apparatus. So you want to talk about a government meddling in somebody else's elections? This government re-elected Boris Yeltsin. Without the help of the U.S., under Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin would never have been re-elected. But he had to be re-elected because the alternative was an anti-Western Russian a person who was running against Yeltsin. Washington could not have that person win. So Yeltsin gets re-elected. People still hate him. They still hate him. And so what does Yeltsin do? He basically, I think he steps down, and he's the one who grooms Vladimir Putin. Now, the idea that Vladimir Putin is somehow some, cagey, slick, sly fox communist who's just been waiting in the wings, I'm just waiting to go take over. That man is not concerned. Well, I shouldn't say he's not concerned. I'm not in Vladimir Putin's head. I can tell you that he's not a communist. To my sadness, he's not a communist. In his speech Friday, he practically said, "Fuck Lenin." I mean, so he's a capitalist. He's very much. Russia is not a communist nation. So we're seeing now, days later, almost a week later, y'all, this narrative that has been woven about this is all Putin unraveling. And it's being unraveled. That's interesting what you said, Ricky, about the thing in MSNBC. It's being unraveled even in the mainstream media outlets. And this is after outlets like the one I work for, Sputnik and RT America, have been heavily censored. RT America has literally closed its doors. They've laid off their entire staff. Thankfully, that hasn't happened with us yet at Sputnik, fingers crossed, but our podcasts have been taken off of all of the platforms. So there's been all of this repression and censorship of anti-imperialist voices already. This has already happened. But the narrative is unraveling about what has been caused in Ukraine. But we still have this problem, y'all, about what the US, EU, and NATO domination has done in countries that are not full of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Euro-looking people that everybody's so concerned about. And I think the connection that we can start with, Ricky, that you mentioned earlier with the people who are trying to leave Ukraine, like we've seen reports of immigrants from African nations, from Ghana, Nigeria, from all kinds of other African nations who have been treated badly, who have been abused, and have been denied the ability to leave Ukraine. And then when you realize, oh, wait, the Ukrainian army is full of fascists because Obama and Biden and Victoria Nuland and John McCain literally gave arms and legitimacy and money to neo-Nazis and fascists in Ukraine. They ended up being in the army. They're in the government. Everyone in Ukraine is not a fascist. No. But to downplay the influence, the presence and the influence of the fascist elements in Ukraine is a grave mistake. Because when you see what is happening to immigrants or people from countries that are not European and the way they are being treated, from Morocco, from Brazil, from India, having to sleep in the woods so they can try to escape the border guards, to get into Poland or Hungary so they can get a flight back to their home countries. And their embassies, particularly the embassies from African countries, Erica, being pretty much powerless to do anything, then I think that is a good place for us to connect what is going on now in Ukraine with not just, oh, the world is focusing on Ukraine because, oh, it's the white people now who are in the middle of war, but what has the US, EU, NATO Axis of Domination been doing in the countries that a lot of those people came from?
Right. A few points I want to raise. I know that I appreciate that you naming that it was multiple colonized people, because I think that there is a framework of only Africans that sort of distracts from the core issue of why these things were occurring at the border. Not so much of who they were occurring to, but why.
Right.
Most of these nations that you named, notwithstanding India, are African nations. And a lot of those nations are under neocolonial rule. They are still under the thumb and stronghold of the EU or the US, or both combined simultaneously. But the other thing that you mentioned about the embassy, I think that is so important that yesterday we shared in our chat image of Chinese immigrants who were in Ukraine, and they were on a chartered plane. They were on their way back to China. And I said, well, that's power. Like that.
Come on now.
Because and then Anya made a point to say, and they knew they probably didn't touch a hair on any of those immigrants because there's a power behind that. And so that speaks to the differences and why we see what happened in a lot of these with a lot of these colonized immigrants that were stuck at that nation, at that border. And interestingly enough, the way that Poland is even being discussed as if it's not a right-wing nationalist country, or even somewhere safer for these folks to cross over into. But yeah, I think that the dynamics of it really exposes imperialism being the primary contradiction on the way that it was not only the brutality of the immigrants there, but the way that it was handled through the embassies, who really had no say of what was happening to their own people. And not so much, I think that we should also know, why are they even there in the first place? I'm sure a lot of these people would love to, stay home and go to school. The reality of the way that, African universities or schools in Africa or schools in India or schools in Brazil are weighed against European and U.S. education. Like, there's numerous stories of African immigrants who are doctors at home and taxi drivers here, because those degrees are not valued, and primarily because of that axis of domination that only, upholds a certain hegemony. So I think that these things are important to note in the ways that it just highlights imperialism being the primary contradiction, in the ways that I think we get swayed away from addressing that with focusing solely on race, because it's not to say that these are not issues of anti-Blackness or prejudice, racial prejudice at all. They are, but I don't think that they're the primary factor in what's driving them to be there in the first place and them to have those experiences.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to, I'm not intentionally ignoring the chat. I'm seeing you all's comments, and I think we're going to get to some of them, but I want to, this is we have to be clear that we're not painting everybody with a broad brush, but we're also not dismissing realities where people do not fit in the. We cannot say that everyone who was in Ukraine was a student who was not Ukrainian was a student, first of all. And second, we can't say that they were all studying STEM. I mean, yes, it's true that education, that a lot of people went to school in Ukraine from other countries because not only was it less expensive, but also when we're talking about the way colonization devalues the institutions of the countries that they colonize. And this is still something that people in those former colonies face, where they can go to a university in, Nepal, or they can go to a university in Nigeria, but that degree is not going to be respected around the world in the European institutions where they may end up having to work. So they have to get their degree from an institution that they know will be recognized as valid from in the colonized or white supremacist world. That, I think, is a symptom of the way colonization still affects the former colonies, and people, honestly, who are still colonized very much so. And people are sending money back to their families when they do have to take jobs in a European nation because they can make more money. This is all related to the power, the international control of capitalism, which is imperialism. And NATO is just, the armed white supremacist gang of global capital. That's pretty much what it is. So when we think about it this way, Anya, and we look at the fact that these students, regardless of, these African colonized people from Brazil and from Colombia, there were some folks from Colombia, some folks from India, and other people were, they were pretty much powerless. There were literally many of them on their own to be able to leave Ukraine. So they're having to face racist oppression trying to leave. But what could it have been like for them living in Ukraine anyway between 2014 and now, when the fascists, when the neo-Nazi groups were being legitimized by the actions of the US and the EU before the conflict even began, right? So it's like, what does this say about the constant threat of danger that the US, EU, NATO hegemony always puts our people in, regardless of where we are in the world?
I mean, so what happened in 2014 is that the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown by a coup that in the Western media was reported as being like a people's movement, but in reality was dominated by neo-Nazis and far-right fascist parties who had openly white nationalist, queer antagonistic, patriarchal pocket politics. Those were the parties that led that so-called people's uprising against that democratically elected president. And those were the parties that the US and NATO powers backed. They gave them money. They gave them weapons. They gave them political legitimacy. Victoria Nuland, as you mentioned, was caught on tape, literally picking the next prime minister of Ukraine with the US ambassador to Ukraine. John McCain was pictured on stage next to a leader of a far-right neo-Nazi party, the right sector, as the dude gave a Nazi salute. Joe Biden traveled to Ukraine 4 separate times when he was vice president under Obama, again, to meet with these far-right neo-Nazi and fascist parties. This is who the US and NATO powers deliberately put in power. This is who the US and NATO powers have been giving weapons to this day. Like, they are still giving weapons to Nazis. And this strategy of backing far-right fascist movements, of backing neo-Nazi movements, is actually really old when it comes to Western imperialism. They've been doing this since the USSR was still around. They would rather back straight up Nazis, like not like metaphorical Nazis, like literal Nazis and fascists, than allow socialist or anti-colonial movements to survive. So they've done it all over Eastern Europe, certainly. They've also done it in Africa. They've also done it in Central and South America. I was just on the Red Nation podcast where they talked about how NATO powers backed Christian fascists in Bolivia to depose Evo Morales. Wow. Like, this is in Venezuela. The fascists they backed were setting African people on fire in the street. That is who the US and NATO powers chose to support. So this is like a clear strategy that they pursue all over the world to deliberately empower and legitimize far-right and neo-Nazi forces to attack socialist and anti-colonial movements. And so the consequence in Ukraine is that these people have significant political power. People always say they have 2% of the seats in the legislature. It doesn't matter. They're willing to do organized acts of mass violence, which gives them a remarkable amount of power in the state. They've also been integrated into the leadership of the police and the military in Ukraine. They hold local and regional political offices. PBS yesterday interviewed Nazi, a literal neo-Nazi who was the mayor of a small town in Ukraine. So these people are completely legitimized. They're getting put on Fox News, PBS, NPR. Like, they have been in power. Even in that PBS interview, at the end, he held up a gun and he was like, "The Americans gave me this gun." What?
Yep, they did.
So just like they've been. For the past 8 years, they've been committing organized mass violence, pogroms against queer people, against immigrants, against women. They have been bombing civilians in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, who after the fascists came to power were like, actually, we would not like to be a part of this. We are going to form autonomous nations. And the Ukrainian neo-Nazi government sent these militias armed and backed by the US and NATO to attack civilians. And again, this happens all over the world, because they would rather fascists and Nazis than socialists and decolonization.
Yep. And since you mentioned that that interview, I had to go look it up because
when Russian troops,
you notice the blurred out part right here. This is the guy. This is the neo-Nazi guy. And how do we know he's a neo-Nazi? Because the picture that he blurred out behind him, you know who he is? He is the notorious Ukrainian Nazi collaborator Stephen Bandera. Nazi collaborator. The man has a picture of him on his wall. He blurred it out thinking that, I don't know why he thought nobody would figure that shit out. But here's the thing that pisses me off. This dude just sitting here having an interview like him, like this whole neo-Nazi is not hanging on his wall. Like, at this point, I don't get, as a journalist, like, how do you continue to go on and do an interview with someone who has a Nazi collaborator on their wall? I mean, it's blurred out for the rest of but how do you not, first of all, how do you not know this dude is a neo-Nazi? How, as a journalist, how do you not know who this person is? And then second, as a journalist, you're sitting there doing this interview and you see that this man has blurred this picture out on this wall and you continue to have a conversation. What the fuck that? What the hell? So in this instance, we see how U.S. media that is funded and controlled by PBS is supposed to be public broadcasting, right? So PBS is U.S. state-controlled media, right? So the U.S. state-controlled media just showed you that they're fine, exactly proving your point, Anya, that the U.S. is fine with collaborating with literal Nazis than it is with allowing the voices, especially the voices of anti-imperialists who are Africans, but anti-imperialists in general, to tell the truth. We get suppressed, but their neo-Nazi friends get prime time on PBS NewsHour. So, that was just a whole mess. I was like, is that Stephen Banter? Oh my gosh. So now we have established yet again, for people who didn't believe us, that yes, there are neo-Nazis in the Ukraine government, and that NATO and the US and certainly the EU are fine. They're just fine with collaborating with fascists, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, the extreme right, in order to get what they want. So Ricky, what does this mean for NATO in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like Libya, like Nigeria, or like Niger, or like Mali? What does this all mean for all of these other countries that are not Ukraine, that are not full of nice blonde, blue-eyed Euro folks that everybody is crying over? What does it mean when the US and NATO are fine with working with, arming, training, and unleashing literal racists in countries full of people that look like you and me?
Right. And then interestingly enough, those same neo-Nazis are trying to get Africans to join them in this fight. No, I mean, we could see the results of the devastation that NATO has done to the African continent. But I think the question now becomes, what are Africans prepared to do in this fight? Because ultimately, it needs to be understood that NATO, the US, EU, NATO Axis of Domination is the primary issue here. And Africa is not free. So the question for Africa, what does it mean for Africa? It means the exact same thing it still means for Africa, so long as we're not free. But that's Africans globally, though, as well. Because what does it mean for Africans here in the US? When we understand, if we can, I think Ony does such a great job at the timeline of the rise of neo-Nazism in Ukraine between 2014 and now. So many U.S. Citizens were traveling over to Ukraine to get trained. And then they were also discovered or exposed as the people who were responsible for Charlottesville. A few of them were discovered, exposed, and outed as people who were in the mix of January 6th. There's an entire January 6th commission happening right now that's supposed to be in resistance to neo-Nazism and the rise of neo-Nazism, using Trump as this red herring in the same way they're using Putin and Trump's alleged relationship, right? To allege that, all the neo-Nazis are on the side of Russia, and to confuse the people. But ultimately, we understand that the January 6th Commission has always been intended to be nothing more than, something to get them garner more votes for a failing Democratic Party. But also, it's a tool to garner more a police state. And when we look at we don't want to refund the police, we want to fund the police slogan. We watch the entire
fund the police, fund the police, fund the police.
Right. And we watch all of Congress stand up and cheer. I mean, the whole crowd went wild, right? So what does that mean for us in the event that we see, even now, currently, so many far-right nationalists in the U.S. are tweeting out that, just landed in Poland, ready to cross out, like so many. are doing that right now. So what does that mean for us as Africans and colonized people here, under these conditions where they legitimize and they back far right and neo-Nazi regimes around the world? This is not something that is just isolated to what's happening in Ukraine. I'm so glad that Bolivia was brought up, because I think Bolivia is a clear example of how even progressives fuck up, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's such a clear example. So I think that, as opposed to, it really disturbs me that how this became sectarian, right? Where it should be clearly understood that there's one major force that's devastating the world, and it's this alliance that refuses to stay in the North Atlantic. They're even trying to swoop in Colombia, and we know that Colombia is the third largest population of Africans. So what would that mean for Africans there if now Colombia is now a part of NATO? What does it mean for Africans everywhere if NATO continues to expand? And I think that's the lens that we should be looking at this through, as opposed to this biopic Russia versus Ukraine that really, as so many Africans are saying, this is white on white, this really has nothing to do with us. And really, I get that, because what fundamentally would Russia and Ukraine have to do with the African here? But if we take a step back and a broader view of who is backing Ukraine, why would Ukraine want to be a part of NATO? If we understand, and I think my comrade Kayla, we did a Hood Communist teaching on this, and Kayla raised that point. We really have to think about why, if we understand what NATO is as a white supremacist organization that brings devastation to the world, then what is Ukraine really? Why do they so desperately need to be a part of that? So I think that those are the things that we need to really analyze and focus on as opposed to getting into the weeds of things that really ain't got shit to do with us.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing, that the other thing that's kind of pissed me off about this whole thing, like what I've been calling like the Putinization of the American consciousness. Like since 2016, everything that is wrong in this country allegedly is Vladimir Putin's fault. Like, the loss of Hillary Clinton it was Putin's fault, because, we silly Black people were so unsophisticated that we could not stop some, rainbow bikini Bernie memes from, keeping us from voting for Hillary Clinton or making us vote for Trump, or they made us not vote at all. I can't figure out which they were supposed to have done. So, Black folks not voting for Hillary was Putin's fault through Russiagate, right? And then Trump and everything he did, Putin made him do all of those evil things, as if those things were not being done to folks. Them damn kids in cages were in cages from Obama, right? So, but nobody pays any attention to the kids in cages until Trump puts more kids in cages, right? And now that the kids are still in cages, by the way, nobody's talking about those kids in cages anymore. Very interesting that all of a sudden a certain person is not president anymore, and people think that these problems go away when they existed before Trump came along. There's still problems now. Some of them are worse, but because Putin has been made this huge boogeyman in this country, and in particular, he's been made a boogeyman, and he has been hung around the neck like an albatross of Black people, particularly Black radicals in this country. We were supposed to have opposed Hillary Clinton because Putin. I mean, that's really all Russiagate was. It was blaming Black people for Hillary Clinton losing an election to somebody she should never have lost an election to, because she was too lazy and entitled to actually campaign. And her own record was so shitty that, she couldn't defend it. So what did people do? They made Putin the problem, but specifically they made, and by people, I mean the Democratic Party, the DNC, and their media apparatus, MSNBC and CNN, they made Hillary's loss not just about Putin, but about Black people being duped by Putin in particular. And we got that narrative from 2016 on, to the point where They had Black women on news outlets shitting on Black men for this little teeny tiny uptick in Black men voting Republican, but nobody paid any attention to the little teeny tiny uptick in Black women voting Republican. So now we're looking at a Democratic president, Anye, who is talking about refunding the police. Everybody in this country, from movie stars to your average person working, in a store, people are pouring out their Russian vodka, and which is not made in Russia, you dumbasses. Smirnoff is not made in Russia. Jesus Christ. You have the fucking internet. What is wrong? Since 2016, Black people in particular, Black radicals in particular, have been saddled with Putin, this albatross around our neck that we've been tarred with. We are Putin's puppets, basically. So when it comes to us having to fight domestically these issues that are the domestic extension of NATO, or you could say NATO is the international extension of US policy, same thing. It's all the same thing. What does it mean now for us, Anye, when we are having to deal with more money for more cops on the streets, which will, of course, lead to more cops killing more people who look like us and our Native brothers and sisters and our Latinx brothers and sisters and our neurodivergent brothers and sisters and our disabled brothers and sisters? What does it look like for us on the streets when we have to, when some people are legit afraid to say, I don't vote for Democrats or Republicans. I am a socialist. I am, a communist. I'm a radical. What does that mean for us now when we are once again in the position of being in the middle of a new Red Scare?
I mean, we're in for a remarkable amount of repression that people are going to justify, and we're already seeing it. Like Joe Rogan was up on there being racist, transphobic, queer antagonistic, he was pro-imperialist, by the way. People call him anti-imperialist. I'm like, I don't know why. But whole controversy around this man did not lose his platform despite being clearly reactionary. As soon as Russia initiates its military operation in Ukraine, it's used as a pretext to deplatform a number of revolutionary colonized people's voices on Russia Today. It's used to deplatform Sputnik, your show, to deplatform revolutionary African voices. And none of this has anything to do with Russia. It's just a pretext to get rid of any mainstream anti-imperialist analysis, to say that if you have any kind of criticism for what the US empire and NATO are doing, then you must be aligned with the enemy. It is full on freedom fries mode now. This is what is happening. They are using this as a pretext to narrow the window of acceptable discourse, to silence any kind of principled criticism of Western imperialism. And it's going to be, unfortunately, successful. We see a lot of people on the left even buying into it because they have bought into the idea that Putin is the ultimate evil, the new Hitler, and he must be opposed. And it's for the US to do that. And it's really, really, really unfortunate. We are going to look back on this time and deeply regret the moves that a lot of people made. And we published an article from you this past Thursday called is this Russiagate's checkmate? And I think that you were absolutely correct. I think that the past 5-6 years of blaming Russia for everything, if it's not sunny outside, it's Russia's fault. If the TV doesn't work, it's Russia's fault. People were prepared systematically for this moment, for the clapback that we are experiencing right now, by demonizing Putin, by demonizing Russia, by pretending they were an existential threat, when really Russia has the economy of a poor global South nation. Russia is only a superpower because of their military capacity. Russia does not have the capacity to interfere in the United States politics to the level that they've been accused of. As a matter of fact, we were told that Russia was manipulating millions of people to get Trump into office. Where is the Russian propaganda now? All I see is Ukrainian propaganda. Where is the Russian propaganda? So clearly, we have been seriously misled about Russia's actual capacity to affect political discourse in this country, but it's too late. It's too late. People were already built, they were set up by Russiagate for this exact moment. And the last thing I want to say is that this like narrative of Russia controlling the blacks or whatever is very, very old. When our ancestors, our revolutionary ancestors were engaged in workers organizing and communist organizing and decolonial organizing throughout the United States, they said the same shit back then too. They said the Russians are controlling the civil rights movement. The Russians are controlling the Black Power movement. When the Ferguson uprising happened, it was implied that Russians were antagonizing that too. So this is like a continuous narrative, racist, imperialist narrative that has been pushed forward every time African and colonized people have just resistance to our oppression. The implication is that we are not capable intellectually or politically of organizing our own resistance, that we must be being manipulated by outside forces, and Russia is the boogeyman, always.
Mm-hmm. I just, when you just said, where is the Russian propaganda now? I mean, when in this country, when there are actors like Edward Norton, who are basically literally calling for the US government to re-implement McCarthyism, basically. Because that's what he's called. He said, please, seriously, please, FBI, CIA, POTUS, wake up Monday morning and focus hard on exposing the people, institutions, and methods by which Russia has compromised our political parties and government. We know there's a lot going on, but you have a lot of resources. Tear it all out by the roots. Bring full hazard and the rule of law down on the collaborators and perpetrators, individual government and military officials with debt or undisclosed compensation, orgs. Oh my God, just when we as a people of people who live in this country who are so disconnected from actual reality and history that they literally call for fucking COINTELPRO 2 3.0 and McCarthy 2 3.0 on Twitter as if that's a good thing. This person has more influence than Vladimir Putin has ever had in this country. And let me just be clear for folks who are wondering, because I know somebody's going to watch this and be like, oh, this must be, the Black Russian network. Black Russian was a nasty drink, first of all. Second, there is we don't need someone in another country to raise the alarm about the crimes against humanity that are committed against our people on these shores and throughout the diaspora. We don't need anyone else to do that for us. We don't need anyone else to compel us to fight for our own self-determination. Vladimir Putin is not sitting around sending us all an email or a text or saying, the US cops killed someone else in another American city today. No. We live that. We know that. And we are not taking this information and putting it out there so that it can be weaponized in other countries, because I guarantee you, people in Russia are probably more clear on the history of racism and white supremacy that has influenced Nazi Germany and world fascism that emanated from this country than anybody really understand. I mean, just the idea that Adolf Hitler's personal train was named America to pay homage to the place where he got all of his fucking ideas. I bet you the Russians know that, since it was 26 million Soviet lives who were lost in fighting fascist Nazi Germany. They know where those ideas came from. So us making these points, us putting together these connections, connecting this struggle against the white supremacist, settler colonial, fascist, patriarchal, anti-queer, just militaristic juggernaut of the US, the EU, and NATO. This is not in any way a hat tip to Vladimir Putin. No, this is just the truth. That's it. And it is unfortunate that we have been talking about these things in our respective organizations for I don't know how many years, but all of a sudden it happens to the nice white people in Ukraine, and now the world wants to be concerned about war. But our people have been at war certainly since we've gotten to these shores, since we were brought to these shores, and our people have been at war around the world since somebody found out that there were resources on the continent of Africa that they could exploit. So this is an ongoing fight, and I'm going to give you all the last word. An ongoing fight that is not influenced by anyone else, and that is not being used, to stoke discontent against the U.S. because that's what somebody else told me too. That you're telling people in other countries these things because you're trying to stir up discontent against the U.S. I think the U.S. doesn't need my help doing that. I think other people around the world are clear on what the U.S. is and what the U.S. does with the EU and NATO. So, Ricky, what can be done? What do we do now? What do we do with this information now that we've not made this about Ukraine, that we've made clear that this is the U.S., EU, and NATO? What do we do about their axis of domination?
Yeah, I think if we are serious about fighting back against fascism, then we really have to confront the enormity and the stronghold that anti-communism has, not just here, but like globally. We are deeply, deeply, deeply infected by anti-communism, so much so that it actually directs and influences the way people are even analyzing the situation. The recent poll shows that the average American still believes that Russia's a communist nation. Um, and then the way that certain people on the left are reacting to people that they're calling tankies is because of the idea that we might believe that Putin is somehow a communist, right? And that's why we're supporting this, because maybe it's us who are confused and buying into all of this rhetoric and trying to spread Russian propaganda. And for me, I feel like the calls to try to call out Putin are not dissimilar for when you criticize Biden and then they call you, a Trump supporter. So in that regard, I don't feel it necessary to criticize Putin. I'm going to be like Paul Robeson about Stalin. You ain't going to get a word from me. You're not going to get it over here. We're going to look for it somewhere else. But then lastly, I did want to make some book recommendations for folks if you want to analyze this moment, especially like this Red Scare moment that's happening. There's a book by Mary Helen, oh Lord, I can't even remember her last name, but it's called The Other Blacklist. And it talks about that period in time where Black communists, particularly artists, like Charles White, like Lorraine Hansberry, et cetera, even Gwendolyn Brooks have gotten caught up in that Black scare, when they talk about how that anti-communism deeply affected any sort of radicalism, even from the most primitive like book clubs and such to those who were like actively running plays and trying to get the work out and the word out about communism, all because they were attached to the CPUSA, having either gone to a meeting or being a full-fledged member. And then the other book that I do have here is the Left of the Color Line, where you get the actual FBI files on a lot of, you get Du Bois's files, you get Claude McKay, and you get to really see the deep impact of that sort of Russophobia, that McCarthy era. And then always I want to recommend, read Claudia Jones's work around the Smith Act and her imprisonment and her incarceration. And I think that would help frame and understand the moment that we're in, because I don't think that people are making enough of alarm about how, yes, there was issues with Joe Rogan. And I think Ajamu argues this all the time, that when we rush to join that reactionary crowd that's like, take them down, take them down, take them down, we don't recognize that we're always the first to go. So nothing did happen to Joe Rogan despite the public outcry, but Sputnik was silently removed. Like there was no mention of stuff. They just pulled it, You need any word or public outcry or anything. They just pulled it. So we have to recognize that capacity. And also, before I end, sanctions. there's a lot of confusion right now
Yes.
about sanctions. And I think that we need to be very, very clear. As Mark and Kimberly explained to me, whatever sanctions are being put on Russia is not necessarily going to impact Russia in the way that we see sanctions impact other places, right? Because Russia's sort of insulated where they produce a lot of their own things, right? So a lot of those things will not so much affect Russia, even though we'll have an impact. But the sanctions are, as the U.S. government has stated publicly, are intended to affect the rest of the nations that are forming a multipolar alliance alongside Russia, like Cuba, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela. So those are the ways that we can see the NATO, the EU, US, NATO Axis of Domination play out through sanctions, right? Because even if it does nothing to Russia, it is intended to hurt everyone touching Russia.
Right.
So that's how I'm going to end it.
Anya?
I would just say that we have to resist this urge to make this something provoked by a singular person. We have to resist this urge to make this something about something that Russia did. We have to do the work to understand the political and historical context that led to this moment of proxy war between nuclear powers. And we have to, especially as people living in the United States, push for de-escalation. So that means no more sanctions. That means no more flooding weapons into Ukraine and into the hands of Nazis. That means no more military funding for Nazis in Ukraine. That means no more of the US and NATO powers intervening and overthrowing democratically elected presidents, backing far-right coups. And it also means that we have to call for the abolition of NATO, period. We cannot accept another country in NATO, no matter what the justification is. We cannot accept NATO continuing to spread its tentacles into the Western Hemisphere. We have to call for true de-escalation, which means the US and NATO powers staying the fuck out of it. Mind your business. Mind your business. We need an actual anti-imperialist movement in the United States that is making these clear demands for de-escalation, because we're in a very, very dangerous situation right now because of the irrational and racist and imperialist foreign policy of Western powers. And the only way back from the brink is an actual anti-imperialist movement that's pushing demands for de-escalation.
Absolutely. And I lied, of course. So look, so there are a couple of questions in the chat that I actually do want to get to if you all can indulge us a few minutes. Let's see. CP Desir said, I just want to clarify this. We say Russia instead of the Soviet Union, obviously, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist as an entity anymore. It is Russia now. So there was a particular point in history where the Soviet Union existed. It does not anymore. Now it is just Russia. So we're making that distinction, and we're clear on that. So I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you very much, Joseph Zora McBride. This is one of the most important contemporary solidarity networks out there. I really love you guys. We really love you too. Let's see. There is. Oh, this is a very good comment. We cannot be so naive to think that if the FBI was willing to deploy COINTELPRO on groups with less than 100 people, that they would not be involved in similar with social media today. This is why last night on the Ask Me Anything, and someone was like, don't say things on the, please, man, the FBI knows everything that I don't. There's nothing I can say on here where the FBI is like, oh, I didn't know that about her. Please. They already know. And one of the questions here for both of you, difficult and light, where can I read more from the speakers on the panel? Ricky?
Hoodcommunist.org. And then subscribe to our newsletter that goes out every Wednesday. We publish every Thursday. There's Hood Communist Radio that's on Spotify and SoundCloud. Oh, and then we're on the Telegram too. So we have a Telegram channel, t.me/hoodcommunist, and you can join our PE sessions. They're bi-weekly, either on an article or a related topic. That's how you can hear from us.
And Anya?
Same. You, if you want to read writing, read
We're
Hood
all
Communist.
in the same.
And then so All African People's Revolutionary Party Southwest Chapter, we have a YouTube channel as well. We do shows on the first and third Thursday of each month, which means the next show is going to be this coming March 10th. So if you want to hear more from my ass, then please subscribe to the APRP Southwest YouTube channel.
All right. So I was asked to please put these things in the chat. So I am putting the link for Hood Communist in the chat. And Anya, where can I put your information in the chat for people to?
I can put the link in there right now.
Okay, cool. So thank you all so much for coming on today. And thanks for the correction, CP Desir. Thank you. You're referring to another commenter. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, thanks. Just wanted to get that straight. It is very, very important, y'all, that we are not just anti-war, right? I feel like being anti-war is very general. I mean, nobody likes war except for people who've never actually fought them and think that they're like, or people who have never actually experienced them. And as colonized people, yes, we Africans in this country are absolutely, we are colonized on this land. We understand what it's like to be at war. We've been at war with this country since we've been here, our ancestors. So we continue to fight, not to just be anti-war, but to be anti-imperialist. We have to end imperialism, just like we have to end capitalism domestically. Imperialism is the international expression of capitalism. And the US, the EU, and NATO, that is the militarized gang of US global capital and Western imperialist hegemony. We must oppose them with everything in our being, or else we will never be free. So I want to thank Ricky Keynes and Onyesanwu Chatoye for joining me today for this special episode. Please share far and wide. Share it to your friends who hate Putin. Share it to your friends who know nothing about Ukraine. Share it especially to your friends who know nothing about all of the other Black and brown countries where what's going on in Ukraine has been going on for years. Be informed, be educated, but be active. Join an organization. Do something. Fight. So thanks, y'all. Thanks for joining me. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time in Lukman Nation. And as always, be good to each other. Be really, really good to yourselves. And peace if you are willing to fight for it.
Peace, Africans. No compromise, no retreat.
No compromise, no retreat. And they are out here throwing up the peace sign like they won something. Yep. I don't understand what they think they want.
I need to revise. I did see white people this happy. I gave the example of America and the Allies' defeat over Nazi Germany. But I haven't seen this many white people happy. There was a couple periods in history. One was when Nutella was introduced. And I mean, I haven't seen that many white people happy since Nutella was introduced and marketed and stuff. Because white people love Nutella.
They booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for they prohibition bandwidth. Blood trickle from the leaders he was planning. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. Boarded that flight to Amsterdam. When my accountant and minus my family found out too and didn't like it. You're not in this alone. What Dale said and I thought he was biased. Then I got a Venmo that said copy the finest. Before my foolishness settled in, recorded a whole tape before we got to Berlin. This close to giving up and now never again. Don't overlook the work and come expecting to win. In the end, my word, never put nothing over the squad. Got it right up under their nose and gentrified the facade. Off the cliff with broken wings, I'm aware of the odds. Enough faith for us all, I'm the one for the job. Most days, catching sun rays, baby, look like the front page. Overthinking what they might say, have it your way. Yeah, the biggest threat is something they never seen. Dial it up, patch me into the screen. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up.